Helen Harris stood before the towering Pierce Enterprises, the morning sun reflecting off its endless glass panels, fracturing her reflection into 1,000 distorted shards. At 26, she had promised herself she would never work in private service again. And yet, here she was. She took a steadying breath, adjusting her simple black blazer. The weight of responsibility pressed heavy on her shoulders, her mother's medical bills, her younger brother's tuition, and the growing mountain of debt that refused to shrink. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. Pierce Enterprises loomed over the city like a monument to power, and she had spent hours researching not just the company, but the man who ran it, Alexander Pierce. CEO, age 34, ruthless, enigmatic, no social media presence. The only thing the press ever managed to dig up about him was his string of failed high-profile relationships, and now she was about to become the only woman living under the same roof as him, even if only in the role of a private housekeeper. Stepping into the top-floor reception area, Helen was immediately greeted by the sleek perfection of white marble floors and chrome accents. A blonde receptionist, polished to magazine cover perfection, regarded her with practiced indifference. "Helen Harris, here for my appointment with Mr. Pierce." After a few moments, a middle-aged man appeared, Richard Wilson, Alexander's chief of staff. "This way." His tone was measured as he led her through a labyrinth of glass and steel. The air was thick with silent authority. At the end of the corridor stood a set of imposing double doors. Richard hesitated for just a second before turning to her. "Mr. Pierce can be intense. Answer honestly and directly." The doors swung open, revealing a sprawling office with floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a breathtaking view of the city skyline. But it wasn't the view that made Helen's breath hitch. It was the man standing at the window, Alexander Pierce. He turned, piercing gray eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her feel as if every carefully constructed layer of composure had been stripped away. "Sit." His voice was deep, commanding. Helen kept her expression neutral, though her pulse betrayed her. Alexander scanned her resume before speaking. 4 years managing the Henderson estate, 2 years as a supervisor at the Royale Hotel. Why leave such prestigious positions? Helen held his gaze. The Henderson estate was sold after Mrs. Henderson passed. As for the Royale, I prefer private residences. They allow for more attention to detail and personalized service. A slight nod, his expression unreadable. "And why should I hire you?" The words left her lips before she could stop them. "Because I'm the best at what I do, Mr. Pierce." Something flickered in his gaze. Surprise or perhaps intrigue? "The position requires you to live on site. Any obligations that might interfere?" "No, sir. My schedule would be entirely dedicated to maintaining your household." Silence stretched between them as he studied her, his gaze assessing. Then finally, "The position is yours. Richard will handle the paperwork. You start Monday." Helen exhaled slowly, keeping her composure as she left the office. But as the doors closed behind her, one thought settled heavily in her mind. She had just stepped into something far more complicated than she had ever imagined. Helen stood before the heavy wooden doors of the penthouse, the place she would be both working and living from now on. Richard Wilson, Alexander Pierce's chief of staff, swiped an access card, stepping aside for her to enter. The doors slid open, and for a moment Helen couldn't suppress her awe. Alexander Pierce's penthouse was nothing short of architectural perfection. High ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city, and a sleek interior dominated by shades of gray, white, and black. Cold, no artwork, no personal mementos, just clinical, calculated perfection. Richard led her through the space, his voice steady as if reciting a script. "Your responsibilities include maintaining the penthouse, ensuring smooth operations, and upholding order. Mr. Pierce values privacy above all else. No visitors without prior approval, no changes to the space." Helen nodded, committing each word to memory. They walked through the living area, where a set of impeccably arranged black leather sofas faced a bookshelf that looked untouched, as if it had been placed purely for aesthetic purposes. Then came the kitchen, an exercise in minimalist luxury. State-of-the-art appliances, marble countertops, and a coffee machine that likely cost more than her previous apartment's rent. Richard continued, Mr. Pierce's daily routine is non-negotiable. 6:0 a.m. Black coffee, no sugar. 6:30 a.m. Protein-heavy breakfast, no carbs. 7:15 a.m. Departs for the office. 8:0 p.m. Typical return time, though unpredictable. No guests, no modifications to arrangements, no personal belongings in shared spaces. Helen silently thought, this isn't a home. It's a command center. Finally, Richard led her to Alexander's private quarters. It was expansive, yet as sterile as the rest of the penthouse, more like a high-end hotel suite than a lived-in space. But one object immediately caught her attention. A silver pocket watch, worn with age, resting on the bedside table. Helen stepped closer, her fingers grazing its surface. The inscription on the back made her pause. To Gregory, with love, Eleanor. Her brows knitted together. Who was Gregory? Who was Eleanor? The watch was the only thing in the penthouse that wasn't pristine, bearing a faint scratch across the surface, as if it had been clutched too tightly in a moment of despair. Richard noticed her interest but offered no explanation. He simply said, Your room is this way. Helen turned away, but the thought lingered. What did that watch mean to Alexander Pierce? She had no idea that this small relic from the past would unravel secrets he had fought so hard to bury. 5:45 a.m. Helen stood in the kitchen, her hands moving swiftly as she prepared Alexander Pierce's first coffee of the day. She had memorized Richard's detailed instructions. Black coffee, dark roast, no sugar, no cream. The high-end coffee machine hummed softly as the rich dark liquid poured into a sleek black ceramic mug. She glanced at the clock. 6 a.m., right on time. Just as she placed the cup on the counter, a deep voice broke the silence. Earlier than I expected. Ellen turned sharply. Alexander Pierce stood at the kitchen entrance. Gone was his usual sharp suit. He was dressed in a fitted black workout shirt and athletic shorts, faint beads of sweat still clinging to his skin. Clearly, he had already been up for hours. She had seen pictures of him online, but seeing him like this was something entirely different. Stay professional, Helen. She took a steady breath, keeping her expression neutral. Good morning, Mr. Pierce. Your coffee is ready. Alexander stepped forward, taking the cup from the counter and sipping it, his storm gray eyes scanning her intently. You've read my schedule. Helen nodded. I believe in being prepared. Alexander set the mug down, tilting his head slightly. The last housekeeper lasted 3 weeks. The one before that, 5 days. Do you know why? Helen met his gaze head on, refusing to back down. I assume they found your standards challenging? Silence. Then, something unexpected. A faint smirk ghosted across his lips. Fair enough. There was something in his eyes now. A challenge. A test. I'm not an easy man to work for, Helen. Helen straightened her posture, unfazed. I don't require easy, Mr. Pierce. I require clear expectations and mutual respect. You've provided the first. I trust we can maintain the second. The energy in the room shifted. For the briefest moment, Helen saw something flicker in his expression. Surprise? Amusement? Or, perhaps, acknowledgement. But he said nothing more. He simply took another sip of coffee before brushing past her and leaving the kitchen. Helen exhaled slowly as the sliding doors shut behind him. For the first time, she realized something. Alexander Pierce wasn't just a difficult employer. He was a challenge. And Helen Harris had never been one to back down from a challenge. 3 weeks had passed since Helen Harris first stepped into Alexander Pierce's penthouse, and by now she knew the rules. She knew exactly when he left, how he drank his coffee without stirring it, how he barely glanced at things yet somehow noticed the slightest change. But there was one thing she hadn't mastered. The way every time Alexander was near, the air seemed to shrink, not from space but from the sheer force of his presence. She felt his gaze on her even when he pretended not to look. Sometimes, he stood just close enough for her to feel the warmth radiating from him, to catch his scent, a mix of cedarwood, whiskey, and something dangerous yet intoxicating. But he had never crossed the line, not once. Until tonight. Helen had spent the entire day preparing for an important business dinner Alexander was hosting at the penthouse. The board of directors of Pierce Enterprises, along with key investors, were attending. She had done this countless times before, but this time the pressure felt different. Not from the event, but from him. The dress he had sent to her room, a deep emerald silk gown, was nothing like the standard work attire she wore every day. It hugged her body in all the right ways, sophisticated yet understated. And when she entered the dining area, catching the moment Alexander's gaze landed on her, the flicker of approval in his eyes told her he had chosen it deliberately. Dinner went smoothly until Arlington, a senior board member, lifted his wine glass, his voice laced with amusement. "Nathaniel Carter just announced his engagement. I think it's about time you settled down too, Alexander." The air shifted. Alexander remained unreadable. "I don't believe my personal life is relevant to this discussion, Arlington." "But," Arlington smirked, "come now, isn't there someone special in your life, or perhaps someone in this very room?" His eyes landed on Helen. She could feel the heat of Alexander's gaze even before she looked up. A prickle of awareness ran down her spine, but she forced herself to maintain a neutral expression, keeping her focus on the pristine white tablecloth in front of her. A long silence stretched across the table, the tension palpable. And then, before Alexander could answer, Helen did what she did best. She controlled the situation. "Mr. Arlington, I heard your company recently expanded into renewable energy. I'd love to hear more about the innovations you're implementing." It was a flawless deflection. The conversation smoothly transitioned, and Arlington, though slightly annoyed, took the bait and began discussing his latest business venture. But Helen knew when Alexander placed his wine glass down, the quiet clink of glass against wood sharper than it should have been, she had touched something far more dangerous than she intended. The evening continued, but after the final guest left, Helen made a swift retreat into the kitchen, immersing herself in the routine of cleaning up, willing herself to forget the unspoken tension of the night. She didn't hear him enter, but she felt it, the shift in the air, the weight of his presence behind her. "You handled Arlington well." His voice was smooth, quiet, too quiet. Helen didn't turn. It was part of my job. Silence. Heavy. Lingering. Then his next words came, lower this time, laced with something she wasn't sure she was ready to name. "Is that all this is to you?" Her fingers tightened around the glass in her hand. "I don't know what you mean, Mr. Pierce." A slow, deliberate footstep, the faint sound of fabric shifting as he moved closer. "Don't you?" His voice was just behind her now, so near she could feel the warmth of it against her skin. "Then tell me, Helen, why did you tense when Arlington implied there was someone in my life?" Her breath caught. He exhaled a soft, dark chuckle. "I think, Helen, that this is no longer just a job." And when she finally turned to face him, she knew he was right. Helen spent the morning reorganizing the library in Alexander's study, a task he had never assigned, but one she instinctively knew was necessary. The books were too perfectly arranged, as if no one had truly read them. As she reached the shelf near his desk, her fingers accidentally brushed against a photo frame tucked behind a row of thick hardcovers. She picked it up, her breath hitching slightly at the sight. Alexander stood beside an older man, both clad in military uniforms. There was a rare smile on Alexander's face. "How long has that been there?" The deep voice behind her made Helen startle. When had he returned? She turned to see Alexander leaning against the doorframe, his hands curled into fists at his sides. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said quickly, placing the photo back on the desk. Alexander stepped forward, picking up the frame, his eyes scanning the image with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "That's my father, Gregory Pierce. This was taken before his final deployment." Helen noticed the way his grip tightened around the frame. "He'll make it back?" Alexander gave a small nod. "He died on a mission. I didn't get to say goodbye." A heavy silence settled between them. Then Helen remembered the pocket watch she had seen on his nightstand. That watch, it was his, wasn't it? Alexander let out a quiet laugh, though there was too much pain in his eyes for it to be called a smile. Yes, my mother, Eleanor, gave it to him on their wedding day. When he died, it was sent back to us. But when I received it, I couldn't bring myself to open it. Helen stilled. That was why the watch remained untouched, frozen in time. Without thinking, she placed her hand over his, a simple but genuine gesture. Alexander didn't pull away. And in that fleeting moment, she glimpsed the man behind the mask, a man burdened by regrets he would never escape. Helen could feel it. The atmosphere in the penthouse had changed. Ever since that night, since the moment her hand had rested on Alexander's in his study, everything between them had shifted. Alexander watched her more often now. She could feel his gaze on her when he thought she wasn't looking. The silence between them was no longer just silence. It carried something unspoken, something dangerous. Helen knew she was walking a fine line, but she never expected they had already been caught. The scandal broke like wildfire. Photos surfaced online capturing stolen glances at the gala, moments where they had stood too close, where Alexander's eyes had lingered on her for just a second too long. And now the board was applying pressure. Helen realized the full gravity of the situation when her phone wouldn't stop buzzing that morning. Message from her brother. Helen, reporters showed up at Mom's house. Her stomach dropped. The office doors burst open. Alexander strode in, his expression dark with fury. They want me to end this. His voice was low, edged with something lethal. Helen took a steady breath, forcing herself to remain calm. You knew this would happen. I don't care. He stepped closer, his gray eyes burning with defiance. No one tells me what to do. Helen wanted to believe him, but she couldn't afford to be selfish. You can handle it, but what about your company, my mother, my brother? Her voice wavered. Alexander stilled, his fingers twitching as if fighting something within himself. Helen looked away. She already knew the answer. That night, she wrote her resignation letter, placed her mother's pearl earrings beside Alexander's pocket watch, and walked out of Pierce Enterprises into the silent night. She didn't look back. What she didn't know, Alexander stood by the window, watching her leave, and he wasn't about to let her go. 3 days after leaving, Helen kept telling herself she had made the right choice. But when the latest news flashed across her phone screen, she knew she had been lying to herself. Alexander Pierce steps down as CEO, transfers ownership to Employee Trust. Her hands trembled as she clicked on the live video. Alexander stood before a sea of reporters, his expression calm but his eyes unshakable. Pierce Enterprises was built for its people, not as a tool for manipulation. He paused, then looked straight into the camera. And I won't let anyone dictate who I care about. Helen's heart stuttered. Helen Harris come home. There was no thinking, no hesitation. She just knew she had to go back. Without a second thought, Helen rushed out of the cafe, hailing a cab back to the penthouse. When she stepped inside, breathless from the sprint, Alexander was already there, as if he had known she would come. They stood in silence, saying nothing, yet everything was clear in the way they looked at each other. Slowly, Alexander stepped forward, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the old silver pocket watch. But this time, when he opened it, there were no ticking hands inside. Just a delicate silver chain with a small compass pendant. I was wrong to think I could go on without you. His voice was deep, steady, but beneath it she could hear the rawness of someone who had almost lost something precious. Helen, I don't want you as my employee. I want you as my girlfriend. Helen looked at the necklace in his palm, then up into his eyes, the most honest she had ever seen them. A small breathless laugh escaped her, a sound of relief, of happiness. She stepped forward, wrapped her arms around his neck, and whispered, "You have no idea how long I've waited for you to say that." Alexander didn't hesitate. He pulled her into a kiss, one that carried no more uncertainty, no more hesitation, just the undeniable truth that they belonged to each other. And this time, Helen knew one thing for certain. She was finally true loved.